Hello, everyone. Hey, Denise.
Hi, Lee.
How's it going? We are live with our second episode of the third season of Just Talk Live, and we're welcoming a special guest co-host, Denise Anderson. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. Destiny's is some large shoes to fill, so I'll try to fill them.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and I'm glad you're here with me today, and to talk with our guest about how we, as people of faith, can dismantle systems of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and do that work together. Uh, but it is really good to see you, and yeah, we are both this is kind of a DC, DMV, Maryland, Virginia type of day because our guests are also, and we are there. So it's just very that type of day today.
It's a hometown production today.
It is a hometown. Yeah, your hometown, and now my new home. And yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and welcome our guests. But for anyone out there viewing, this obviously is live, but this will also be a recording of this will also be on Unbound social medias, on Facebook and on Twitter, and you should check out our YouTube channel. It's all going to be on there under the Just Talk Live playlist and probably on the main page. And so y'all can check that out on there if you want to watch later, which a lot of people do, which is cool. So we are going to welcome our guest onto the stream. Hello, guest. It's good to see y'all. And yeah, we would love just introduce yourself to the people out there. And we'll start with Alana. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Rabbi Alana Suskin. Hamza and I, who Hamza will introduce himself in a minute, have been collaborating for a number of years on a project to talk about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism here in the United States. I've been ordained both as a conservative rabbi and as an Orthodox rabbi. I live in the DMV. Lee, welcome to the area. It's great. And
Thank you.
Reverend Anderson and I kind of go way back to where, we worked on the Poor People's Campaign together, and I'm really excited to be collaborating with all the four of us together.
Awesome. Welcome, Hamza.
Hello. So Rabbi Alana and I have been working together on an initiative called the Pomegranate Initiative that combats Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And our hope was, before the pandemic happened, that we would take this initiative to churches across America and help educate them about how they can help us stand up to those twin demons of anti-Abrahamic faith sentiment that has risen so much in recent years because of various supremacisms and neo-fascist movements across the country. We also found ourselves suddenly very involved in combating a virulent strain of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here in our home state of Maryland, where both Rabbi Alana and I are from. And I think, Denise, you're from around here too. And Lee, we just dragged you into the DMV. So this is your problem too, called Hindutva, which is a Hindu supremacist, Hindu nationalist movement that is very anti-Christian, very anti-Muslim, and was founded on anti-Semitic principles with the help of the Nazi Party and fascists in Italy. So here in Maryland, we found ourselves in the front lines of combating all three demons: anti-Semitism, anti-Christian sentiment, and Islamophobia all at once. And we've been working really hard on that issue for the last couple of months. So that's our background together. We've been working together for 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years now, Rabbi Alana, on various.
It's 2017.
Yeah,
since 2017. Yeah.
So yeah, we're in 2023, so 6 years. Time has flown by. We become really good friends, and we also have a very interesting dynamic where, as a millennial, I am very much a shoot from the hip kind of guy, and as a rabbi, Rabbi Alana is much more thorough in her preparation for everything. So our two energies come together in a really cool way, and it's a pleasure to be here with all y'all today.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. We are excited to have you for this conversation. And yeah, Denise, you want to get us started?
I absolutely will. And just so you know, Hamza cares for a relative. And so sometimes he may have to drop off of the screen, but he is here. And we are so grateful for both your presence, Alana and Hamza. And as Alana alluded to, we go way back from the very beginnings of the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival. Back when it first started and I was first living in Maryland, she and I were part of the coordinating committee for the state of Maryland. And over the years, we have had some really fruitful conversations around faith and justice and all of those really important things. And what is particularly pertinent about this conversation today is our last General Assembly in 2022 received a document called the Statement Denouncing Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as a study document of our denomination. And we have been directed to distribute that document to all of our churches, all of our middle governing bodies. But, you know, it's also worth a conversation to talk about what those things actually mean for those who probably won't read the document, though I highly recommend it. And so, Rabbi Alana, if you want to begin, can we just start with some basic definitions of what is anti-Semitism and Islamophobia?
So I'll address the anti-Semitism piece and I'll let Hamza address the Islamophobia piece. Hang on for a minute, because this gets a little bit in depth historically. So anti-Semitism originates in European Christianity. It's a form of, so I'll go even further back than that. It's a form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. That's sort of like your on one foot piece. And in Europe and the United States, it's functioned largely to protect a prevailing economic system, and even sort of in Europe, especially in the Middle Ages, the exclusively Christian ruling class, by diverting blame for hardship onto Jews. So it starts out sort of historically that there were two different ideologies which are sort of mashed into one thing called anti-Semitism. But I would call the first one actually anti-Judaism instead. And it arises out of the fact that sort of this new religion of Christianity arose out of Judaism. But when Paul brought his teaching to a non-Jewish audience, and most of his followers weren't Jewish, and anti-Judaism then develops as a response to the question about what to do about why Christians aren't Jewish. It's a theological problem. How do we relate to the people that Jesus came from? And there were different ways that people could have or did respond. So like one bad one is supersessionism, that Christianity has replaced Judaism, that Judaism's covenant with God has been revoked and given to Christians. And it's important to understand that most modern sects of Christianity have really struggled with this and have worked to find a different way to relate to Judaism. But a few consequences that have arisen from the sort of Christian historic response to Judaism have been that Jews have been viewed as having rejected Jesus. Many Christians don't realize that the Hebrew scriptures don't mention Jesus at all. So not accepting Jesus was in fact, the only legitimate choice for Jews, because the Bible has a legitimate interpretation that is not about Jesus. And some ways in which these ideas have played out have been in particular about the tension between universalist religion and particularist religion. So Judaism is particularist. It's for Jews. It doesn't mean that other religions are illegitimate, but rather that those who aren't Jewish aren't required to obey Jewish law, to obey the same rules. It doesn't mean that people who aren't Jewish don't have a relationship with God. To the contrary, the scriptures are really pretty clear in a number of places that they do. On the other side, Christianity is a universalist religion, so it's often historically been interpreted that people must convert, sometimes whether they want to or not, in order to receive God's grace. So Christian anti-Judaism, remember this is early historic, right, has in practice led to violence against Jews. But it's not a racial problem, it's a theological problem. And it's important to understand that the pieces of this, which continue to exist in Christian cultures, especially in Europe, where it's deeply embedded in state structures, are still extant and play an important role in doing harm to and oppressing Jews. On the other hand, so the second thing, what I'm going to call anti-Semitism, comes out of white supremacy. And its first inklings are seen in the ideology of limpieza de sangre in Spain in the late 15th century. So in 1593, the Decree de Genere forbade, despite its founder, Ignatius of Loyola's express statements, it forbade any Jewish or Muslim conversos, and by extension, any person with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, no matter how distant, from admission to the Society of Jesus. But the idea of Jews as a race really came into its own in the 18th century during the rise of scientific racialism, whose work can be seen in the taxonomic work of the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, that's late 18th century, when he characterizes the racist in a pretty appalling way. He says there are 4 races: Asiatic, European, African, and American. Racial anti-Semitism is built by white supremacists who identify themselves as white supremacists and anti-Semites at a time during the Enlightenment when it was becoming uncouth to bar people by virtue of their religion. But of course, race, which was science, was another matter. So that's fine, right? So instead of barring from society and various professions on the basis of religion, they identified Jews with negative traits previously ascribed to the religion. Now it's ascribed to the Jewish race, thus turning anti-Semitism into a racial category, which we still see today among white supremacists. So Jews would be racially labeled. So there were like 3 axes: moral, physical, and spiritual. Jews were labeled as morally and physically inferior by race, but superior by intellect. And so compare this to the categorization of the racial labeling of Black people with racial scientism as morally and intellectually inferior, but physically superior. And now you've laid before you a large chunk of the ideology of today's white supremacists who still use the same kind of language. They talk about how Black people would be naturally subservient if it weren't for those manipulative Jews who, are riling them up. And you see where this goes pretty quickly. So these Jewish moral traits also get associated with particular physical traits like big noses, right? But Judaism isn't a race, of course. Jews come in every color and ethnicity that there is, right? And I just briefly want to touch on how we got from there to Jews are white, which seems to be the current hot take. So I think we all understand there are no white people in the Hebrew scriptures. So how is it that Ashkenazi Jews look white? So if there's one thing that both Jews and Black folks know about, it's what happens to the women of subjugated peoples, right? There's a fair amount of documentation about the rape of and prostitution of Jewish women in various historical settings. And it even makes appearances in Jewish literature in the form of suicide narratives, where groups of Jewish women, having been captured by the Romans or the Syrian Greeks, or later on various European groups, vow to commit suicide, in some stories taking their captors with them, sometimes just taking themselves out of the picture. But whiteness for Jews is a recent phenomenon. Jews were historically considered racially non-white, including here in the US. And in other countries, even today, Jews remain racially other. And I can tell some stories about that if you want. But I want to be clear that here in the US, especially in coastal cities where most Jews congregate, white-appearing Jews do receive white privilege. But I do want to just kind of show you some images here about, in the US, about anti-Semitism. Like, I can personally remember back in the 1980s, country clubs that didn't accept Jews. So we're in the DMV here. There was one in Bethesda where there was a scandal because a legislator tried to join and it came out that no Jews were allowed. And so I'm going to, let's see, I can show some images. Oh, you've got them up. Thank you. So there's, there were signs that you could see all over the US and Canada also: no Jews, no dogs, no Blacks. Sometimes it also said no Mexicans. These signs are all from Maryland, where I live. And I would stress that this state is a very welcoming, diverse place. So when I bring these as examples, it's worth knowing that, I'm happy to be here because there's more and worse elsewhere in the US and across the world. So just to sort of scroll down quickly to the next picture, right? Here's another one, Gentiles only. This was in Beverly Beach. This is here in Maryland in Mayo. And then just the last two images kind of quickly to show you that this is still an extant problem. This was last November 2022. This was on the Bethesda Trolley Trail, which I walk on all the time. And then the final one is from December of 2022, just a couple of weeks ago, Walt Whitman High School in Bethesda. It's not so clear in the picture, but what it says is Jews not welcome. There was a rash of these signs that went up, graffiti around the state of Maryland, which is actually now being addressed by Montgomery County and some other organizations. But this is not something that has gone away. It still exists. And then I'm just going to kind of wrap up with a couple points, right? Some of the tropes that we see, the most common tropes about anti-Semitism include claims of power, that Jews are an all-powerful secret puppet master behind the scenes of world events, like the classic 20th century anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, conspiracy theories that Jews cause disease, pandemic, war, that Jews run Hollywood. You can think about Kanye West's recent claims. That's one kind of class of trope. Another one is greed or wealth, that Jews love money or control world financial systems or media, or that we were very involved in the slave trade. A third one is disloyalty. We heard that from the former president, claims that Jews are untrustworthy and or disloyal, that they're more loyal to Israel or to world Jewry than to their own country of citizenship. And then the fourth one is sort of Jews are generally evil. We're in league with the devil. We drink blood. We kill babies. We're a corrupting inhuman force in some way. And it's also important to know that sometimes these are disguised as positive ideas, that powerful, smart, good at making money. The main thing is to remember, like, Jews as a class, if you say all Jews are, or Jews are mostly some particular thing, that's a bigotry and it's false. And you can see some ways recently of how this played out in real time, right? The Tree of Life Synagogue a couple of years ago, where a man came in and he believed, Jews were responsible for, all these dangerous immigrants coming into the country, and he shot up the synagogue and killed a lot of people. Or the recent comments from Kanye West. I can put up actually a link, I guess, if people want it, about the 5 examples that he said, how they play into anti-Semitic tropes. We can come back to that later if people are interested. But I think that's basically on one foot, like the explanation of anti-Semitism. Now I'm going to sort of hand it over to Hamza for him to talk about Islamophobia.
So Islamophobia is a virulent strain of prejudice in the United States today and across the world, particularly in Western Europe, that focuses on the exclusion of Muslims and the Islamic faith from public society, mostly as a political force. And it has been furthered mostly by far-right organizations with a political agenda to exclude Muslims as the new other, so to speak. It has been a part of Western society going back to the Crusades and slightly before that. But today's Islamophobia is disconnected from that epic part of our shared history, from the sense that the Crusades were actually partially about religious freedom issues on both sides. In the case of Islamophobia today, it is largely about curbing the religious freedoms of Muslims in the West, for the most part, and also now in East Asia, particularly in China, with the oppression of the Uyghur Muslims and the deliberate concentration camp movement to put 2 million of them in concentration camps by the Chinese Communist government in China. So the focus largely is to break Islam as a communal force, and then also to punish Muslims for participating in society as self-identifying with the minority faith. And it became part of our modern day American experience during particularly the post 9/11 period, after Arab supremacist terrorists belonging to Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001, when I was 13 years old, and claimed it was the name of Islam. And in doing so, they also added into their doctrine that their hope was to create a Nicene conflict between the Muslim world, so to speak, and the Western world, and to divide Muslims and non-Muslims from each other. So it was their intention to create Islamophobia in attacking the United States. And so since that point until now, we've seen white supremacist groups and groups claiming to be Christian nationalist groups. So I think we know that they're not particularly Christian in any way, use Islamophobia as a political force to garner support, particularly in what we consider the Old South and much of the Midwest, in the hopes that they can create a political movement that, through their evangelization, so to speak, will unify otherwise very disparate forces in a semi-racist, clearly bigoted and prejudiced movement that will deliver votes almost for free to politicians who have little else to offer their constituents aside from a nationalist agenda. We have also seen Islamophobia become part of American parlance through another set of political forces, which were well documented by the New York Times during the last political cycle, which is Hindu nationalists. And if you look very closely at the footage that we have of January 6th and the riots and the attempted coup on Congress, on January 6th, there are a number of Indian flags that are proudly displayed by people trying to storm the US Capitol. Those individuals are Hindu nationalists who, because of the violence that was part of partition in 1947, when British India was partitioned into Pakistan and India, they believe that India should not be a secular democracy, but a theocratic Hindu nationalist society with a very wild reinterpretation of traditional Hinduism to favor light-skinned elites who they consider to be of higher caste and higher birth, and view Muslims as foreign invaders or people who converted for some political or social reason, and must be cleansed from Greater India, and as Greater India, including in their minds all of Jammu and Kashmir, what is today Pakistan, and what is today Bangladesh, as well as Nepal. And so this strain of Islamophobia, which is very well funded and put a lot of money into super PACs to help Donald Trump win his 2016 electoral bid, has become more in the last 4 or 5 years the greater strain of Islamophobia in the United States, with an effort to marginalize Muslim Americans and prevent them from being elected to public office, to introduce into American textbooks a very Islamophobic reading of history, with an effort in particular to make Muslims, regardless of their background, appear as if they are vengeful conquerors who are obsessed with lust and power across the world. It's a wild reinterpretation of the idea of critical religious theory or critical history, with the idea of making Muslims to be the ultimate boogeyman in society. Here in Maryland, we have seen a very vast effort, very well-funded effort to elect Hindu nationalists with strong Islamophobic opinions and strong allegiance to Islamophobic forces abroad to political office, which is something that Rabbi Alana and I have been working closely on in recent times.
Yeah. And as y'all were speaking, it just made me really think about, the ways in which the church, which we are a part of the church, the Christian tradition, and the way in which the church has perpetuated this bigotry and these sins that y'all were talking about, and y'all referenced them a little bit, but I also wonder, like the work that y'all are doing, how have you seen on the other side of faith communities maybe coming together, or how are we as people of faith in general? Some people may look at this, and I get this all the time. It's like, well, these are political issues, and this is like leftist, and just on the comments on YouTube, there are even bots that I've already had to delete that are anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. There are, like, it's just happening right now as we're doing this. And all this is so theologically grounded in many ways. But I wonder, on the other side, how have you seen faith communities kind of speak out against, or the work that y'all are doing, or the work that we should be called to do? I wonder what you've seen and what you might say to faith communities out there that that may be not so ready to do this work, and why they should be doing this. I mean, it might be obvious to us, but I think it is something that is important to talk about, since the church has been a big perpetuator in all these. So, yeah, whoever wants to start with that, but I just wonder.
I mean, I could say a little bit. So, I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that actually there has been a significant amount of work done on these issues already. The Catholic Church has really, led the way. The Catholic Church historically has a great deal of anti-Semitism baked into its ideology and practices. But as early as the mid-20th century, we start seeing that the Catholic Church trying to address that. So Pope John Paul II, took part in this historic Second Vatican Council, which was convened by Pope John the 23rd, which was to modernize church practice and doctrine. And in 1965, it issued the Nostra Aetate Declaration, which, stated that Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus. It renounced its claim that Jews had been rejected by God. It condemned anti-Semitism and called for mutual understanding and respect between Catholics and Jews. And as Pope, John Paul II turned these words into action. In 1978, when he was elected as Pope, he really devoted a lot of energy to improving relations between Jews and Catholics. He met with Jewish leaders. He repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism. He commemorated the Holocaust and established diplomatic relations with Israel. And, that's just one of many, many denominations of Christianity which really have struggled to cleanse themselves of the stain of anti-Semitism in various ways. Hamza mentioned at the beginning, like what happened, that we formed this organization to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And that's because really the most important thing is what happens on a local level. When we travel to churches around the country to talk about it and help communities work on these issues, we studied what the best practices were when we were creating our programs. And what we discovered that like the two most important things are, first of all, to just have relationships with people so that you know them. This has to be more than the occasional Martin Luther King Day joint project or, exchanging sermons once a year, but to really get to know people, to know individuals as individuals, so that you can understand that, they're not a conglomerate identity, that they're human beings like you are. And the second is to create a culture within your faith community that creates an atmosphere where people speak up when they hear myths about Jews or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists or whatever it happens to be, right? It's essentially the good side of peer pressure, and it works. People are really deeply swayed more by their friends, families, and communities than they are by anything else, like giving them intellectual information. I hate to say it, but like webinars are great, but they don't actually sway people's feelings. What sways people's feelings is their friends saying, hey, I actually know this guy Hamza and he's awesome. Let's go have coffee together so you can get to know him. Or, I heard you say that all Jews are rich, but it's really not true. Like, I have this friend, Alana, and like she was lower middle class all her life. Let's just go have coffee with her, or, whatever it happens.
But she is pretty awesome. So she's worth getting coffee with anyway. Though she doesn't drink coffee, she drinks tea. So.
I'm a tea drinker. I'm sorry, but that's like really key, is to have those individual relationships. And what faith communities can do is they can facilitate them. And hey, Hamza and I are definitely available to help you with that. But you can do that on your own too. Make sure your pastor is aware that you need to reach out if there's a synagogue and a mosque or a mosque in your community. Like, reach out to them, get to know the religious leaders there, engage in some kind of long-term project where people are interacting with each other on a consistent basis. Doing projects together is a great way to make friends, and this is a really important thing to do. And the faith communities as a larger institution, like the national organizations, can help that by encouraging their local communities to do that work and to train people to stand up and speak up.
And I guess I want to piggyback off of that. I mean, we've worked on quite a few grassroots projects together, Rabbi Alana, over the last 6 years, and what we found the most, and I'm going to use some cliche terms from my work in politics, retail engagement, one-on-one engagement has made the biggest difference across the board. working with lay people in churches and mosques and synagogues and Hindu temples and Buddhist organizations. And beyond that, the Ambedkarite community, which is the preferred term for people who were formerly known as untouchables, has been incredibly rewarding and has also really gained us a number of allies on the ground. Because when we do a trickle down approach when it comes to religion, going from a hierarchical structure and expecting from high up upon the mountain, be it the religious ivory tower or be it the spiritual pinnacle, it's harder for the everyday person in our busy consumerist materialist driven age to find time to connect with that in a meaningful way. You have to be on the ground. You have to be where everyday people are making a difference in their local communities. Essentially, this is spiritual, religious federalism at work, right? Where we're working with the folks who actually make the difference. And it pairs well with basically the American dream and the American construct in terms of how we are very much a ground up sort of people. All elections are local, therefore, all social issues are local. And when it comes to the political divide, when people go, this is a political issue and whatnot, because of how polarized America has become in the post Trumpian era, or I guess the Trumpian era, there has been much more of a willingness by religious organizations and people who are members of religious organizations, be they congregations, be they social networks, be they charities, to play a more active role in shaping what the greater conversation is like. To borrow directly from the Quran, in the Quran, it states, "Oh, humankind, verily we made you from one soul into many nations and tribes so that you might come to know one another." So this idea of diversity and plurality is baked into the Islamic faith per dictum of God. And the same is true in the Christian tradition as well, in many ways, right? When we talk about Pentecost and Christ's role in ensuring that his apostles could speak the word of God, the good word, across the world. Hence, St. Thomas ending up in South India 2,000 years ago to bring Christianity to the people of India. And in Judaism, the idea of being the light upon nations is so important to this as well. The idea that we lead by example and we help the rest of the world be more moral and engage in objective morality through our good works and our commitment to ethics, and the wisdoms of the fathers and the mothers. So we found this to be really rewarding on the ground level. And then it helps a lot that both of us have spent a lot of time outside of our religious communities throughout our lives. Like, I think for Rabbi Alana, becoming a rabbi was like career number 3 after getting like some advanced degrees in Russian and hoping to be in the intelligence space. And then for myself, I was president of a Jewish fraternity in college. I have a Judaic studies minor. I went to a Catholic school as a boy. And then before that, I went to a Presbyterian preschool. And my parents are products of an Anglican education. Both my mother and father went to Anglican schools their entire lives. And so that pluralism and that sense of being part of the American experience in more than one lens helps us in everyday conversations with people whom we want to educate about these issues.
I just feel like we need an opportunity to breathe, because this is really heavy, right? And just not only that, but you all have just poured so much into us. And it's interesting what you said, Rabbi Alana, because the document that the PCUSA has commended to the church to read and study, like, outright says facts and figures aren't going to be the thing that like turns hearts. It has to be something else. And I think that's the most frustrating thing for me. Like, and for those who really aren't in those conversations, like, what are just some basic step 1 places to start?
I mean, I think it's going to be harder because there definitely are places where there aren't many Jews, or there aren't many Muslims, or there aren't many of either. And in that sense, it is much more difficult in some places to build those relationships. If you have no Jewish community there, like Jews have an obligation to pray as a community, right? So they tend to cluster in places where there are other Jews, in cities largely. So if you're somewhere in the rural Midwest, there's going to be a lot fewer of us.
But you can always call us, right?
Move you right in, Hamza. But I think that's one of the reasons why Hamza and I started the organization that we did, is because it's an opportunity. We will come to you, right? You'll get a chance to meet us and talk to us over a few days and get to know us and ask questions. Sort of the live AMA, right? It's not ever going to be as good as, having somebody who you can be friends with who lives next door, but it is a way to sort of jumpstart those relationships. And, once you meet a few people, and you can then start using the relationships that you built with us to build relationships with other people. You can use the internet. We can help support that in order to, help people come to know other people. And ultimately, it's kind of ridiculous, but ultimately that is the key, right? That's it. We just have to learn to love each other by knowing each other.
Yeah. And that's like facts and figures can be the easy thing. It's easy to look at facts. It's easy to look at figures, and I think like
love those things too. Presbyterians love like documents and papers.
Yeah, and like writing and things like that, and those things are very, that's the easy thing to do. It's hard to get to know people, and it's hard to. I mean, I just moved here like a year and a half ago. It's hard to make friends, period, especially as an adult. And
DC is not a place to make friends easily.
It's just not easy in general.
Welcome to the jungle. But we're your friends.
I might disagree, but it depends on who you are.
It depends on who you are. But I do think, that's why, like, as kids, you're like not very like, you don't have a lot of boundaries, and there's not those things that necessarily like you kind of can just jump in and just make friends whenever. But like that's the hard work, is the relationship building. And that's the things that aren't easy. And that's the things that people just don't necessarily want to do, because it is in the long game. It is the long game. We all want the short game. We all want the quick fixes, but it is in these like everyday meetings that I don't think we give it enough credit. I think that is because we don't give it enough credit, and because we elevate the writing, and we elevate the facts and figures, so much so because we also elevate academia, which is a whole nother thing. And we did talk about that once on Just Talk Live. You should go check it out. But we just denounce, we lower relationships, and we've just in society in general. And so it is the hard part. Like, it's hard. Hard to love, I think.
It's funny that so when you talk about like, with kids, it's much easier to make friends. And I'm gonna take issue with the whole DC thing, but I'll set that to the side for a minute, because I think one of the things that actually makes it easier in DC in some ways is because people are very project oriented here, right? They're here because they care deeply about something, right? Granted, there's people who just live in this area, right? And that's kind of they grew up here. But people who come to DC come because they're deeply embedded in an idea that they want to promote. And you can that's how you meet other people, is you get involved in projects with them. And I think, your comment about when it's a kid, it's much easier. It's not just because you're more open. It's because there's a structured environment for you to do it, right? You go to, that's why public school is incredibly important, and why we, aside from the education piece, right? Or maybe as part of the education piece, it's that you go every day with people who you might not have met otherwise. There are people who might be bussed in, or, they live next door to you, but, maybe you don't have anything in common with them. You're going to go to school with those people every day for years and years and years. at the minimum, you're at least rubbing up against them every day. And that is a structure that we do not have as adults. I mean, yeah, your workplace, but that's a much smaller kind of thing. It's much looser. And it doesn't work in the same way. Same with college. That's why sort of the best friends that we have tend to be people who we met before we graduated from college or high school, right? Because those are the people who were really part of our lives in a really intimate way, and not just intimate, but even more importantly, regular way. And so I do think that makes a difference, right? And that's sort of the same thing as saying, make sure your church gets involved in a project with a synagogue or with a mosque or both. Because that, if you can say, hey, every week for the next 3 years, I'm going to be meeting with these people and doing, building houses for the poor, or advocating, for rent decrease, or whatever it happens to be, right? That's really the key to it, is you're going to have conversations with those people because you now have something in common with them and a common goal.
And you can always reach. So this is important. I got to give us a plug here. You can always reach out to the Pomegranate Initiative. I mean, both Alana and I are available for that cultural competency piece, where if you're in South Dakota, it might be kind of hard for your historically almost all Scandinavian or all English background church to build a meaningful relationship with a very immigrant heavy mosque of Somalis, Pakistanis, and Afghans. And you might not know, how do I start a conversation? Should I bring my favorite pie because it is made with lard in the crust? Probably not. Give us a call. Let's help you figure out how you build those relationships. And this is like going back to the DC area being hard to make friends. It's easy to make friends if you come from the lens of, I have a purpose in my life, and that purpose includes making meaningful relationships. The DC area is just so infamous for transplants coming in from everywhere in the country who come here, like Rabbi Alana said, with a given purpose. They are here and they're project oriented. And so it's kind of hard to break into the scene. But that's why, Lee, you're welcome to be our friend. You are our friend, right? So the both of you, Denise and Lee, please come over for chai and coffee. We'll be happy to have you out here in Moco or anywhere else. And Denise, you're out in Waldorf, correct? You're in Southern Maryland? I grew up in Southern Maryland as a boy, and I can tell you that was one of the most important experiences in my life, because it is a lot more rural than the rest of Maryland. And there's a beautiful mixing of cultures here. We actually do have 2 state recognized Native American tribes out in Southern Maryland too, in addition to an Amish community, in addition to a mosque that was built by Saddam Hussein, believe it or not, out in Prince Frederick. Though nobody at that mosque supports Saddam Hussein. We should probably get that out there. You have so much diversity and so much beauty in such a small area, only 30 minutes away from the nation's capital, with a very rustic and rural feel to it. So keeping those sort of experiences in mind, and understanding just that everyone is human, and not all of us are blessed with the gift of the Pentecost. We don't speak tongues. We don't have an understanding of our neighbor fully. But that shared humanity is so important to, I have good intentions. Will you hear me out with my good intentions? And vocalizing that. That's very important to a lot of these communities. The best way to be an ally is to show up and be a friend first. And that's that positive, proactive, intentional involvement makes a huge difference.
The best way to be an ally is to show up and be a friend first. Yeah, and to that I say amen. And the doors of the church are open. And Charles County is interesting too, because that diversity that you talked about, Hamza, is only growing. Like between the 2010 census and the 2020 census, it has been an explosion of increased diversity. It's very beautiful in that way, and it is, still pretty scarce.
Yeah, and I'm from a very rural, like 700 people town in South Carolina. And I know that there are people in like those parts of the world and in the country where maybe people don't realize that this is even connected to them. I think often in my experience growing up in a rural area, it's like, oh, these issues aren't connected to me. We don't have any Jewish people here. But there is diversity in those spaces, no matter where you go. When it could be, what is the immigrant population in that specific space. I remember the first time a Hindu family moved into our town, and that was one of the largest kind of conversations our little town had, because everything was Christian centric. Everything was on the Christian calendar. We all went to public school, but it might as well have been private school, a Christian private school. It was all very different. And so these things do impact no matter where you are. But it seems like these like smaller communities, like where I'm from, but that can be so insular, where people um may not think that this is connected to them. And so I wonder, how do we also say, you might not think it is, but these things are connected, and relationships within any context are important. That's just very interesting.
Howard, so I mean, there's so much to say about all of this. I mean, in terms of diversity, there is nowhere where we are really totally disconnected from one another. I mean,
right.
Trite little idioms about butterflies in Antarctica and all that. But it's true, right? Like,
yeah,
our money is connected with each other. Our environment is connected. All of those things are relevant, even though it does seem, and look, it doesn't matter what community we live in. If you can be insular, right? Usually not on purpose. Usually it's seen as a positive thing. It's a strengthening thing, right? Let's pull together, and that's not bad. And I would also even add, like, sometimes even in those very insular communities, right, you might have these sort of leftover tropes that you don't know are sort of embedded in your worldview, right? So, like, I'm going to use Europe as an example. Like, for Jews, that was a really big problem, that we lived in these... Jews are a very small population. Most people don't realize this, because we sort of play an outsized role sort of in the narrative, but we are not a lot of people, right? Kanye West has more followers than there are Jews. So that's why Jews flip out when Kanye West starts talking about, what did he say, going ballistic on whatever it was, the phrase he used, right? He has more followers than than there are Jews in the world. Yeah. So it's scary, right? So it's very possible to live in a place where you will never meet a Jew, but and then you're going to get your idea of Jews from television, which is, a mixed bag at best, right? Like all television, it's fiction, it's man bites dog. We are not all Seinfeld or The Nanny. In fact, I would largely suggest very few of us are. And similarly, like the way Muslims are portrayed on television is not exactly positive either, and not accurate. So, to say like, oh, I don't have any role in there. I don't know. Do you watch TV? Do you read articles on the internet? Are you on social media? Then you probably actually are interacting, if not with actual Jews and Muslims, then at least with tropes about them. And, so it is important to, have some kind of self-awareness of that. And I just want to say, kind of on the positive side, though, like my own personal experience in going to small towns like that is often that once you get there, right, people are very open. Like even in places where I've gone to talk about Judaism with like deeply evangelical, communities, right, where they're basically like, it's really a shame you're going to hell because you're kind of nice, right? I still feel like, in those conversations, yes, okay, fine. There's issues with that, no problem. But I don't feel like there's a difference between like malicious malicious orientation versus sort of oh, that's just what what I've learned, and I'm kind of filing it in the back of my head. And those things do need to be unlearned, but there's also a certain level of respect that I found that sometimes I don't even get from my own fellow faith practitioners. So, as an Orthodox rabbi, right, I keep kosher and I keep Shabbat, and, there are these restrictions. And I have found that there's actually a deep respect of that from deeply religious Christians in a way that I often don't get from secular Jews, right? Which is funny when you think about it, but also kind of obvious. And, so in that sense, like, there's not necessarily only bad things about those kinds of, insular communities. They do often teach respect in a different way. And I think there's ways to sort of find bridges through those things. So,
yeah. I just want to add one really fun tidbit to this, which is that two of my closest friends, one is Seventh-day Adventist, the other one is Roman Catholic, and then the third one is Methodist. And Rabbi Alana is friends with all of them too, through me actually. They all have prayer rugs stashed away at home because they expect that when I show up, I might have to pray. It's only 5 minutes long. Like Muslims are very quick in their personal prayers, but that's a proactive approach to interfaith harmony, is that, keep available a prayer rug for a Muslim guest or a Bible for a Christian guest if they want to refresh themselves in the teachings of Christ. We have a couple of Siddurim at our house too, for Rabbi Alana if she wants to use one. Just a heads up.
That's okay. I have one on my phone, but I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but in any case, like one important thing for anyone listening is that be proactive in your grace as well. It might be very much so that there's a cultural divide between you and someone you want to show fellowship with, or someone you want to show up and be friends with and be an ally to. You might not understand their approach to the world. You might not understand why a religious Muslim man with a rather long beard might not want to look a woman in the eye. It's not disrespect, it's out of respect. And same thing is for some Orthodox Jews. You might not understand why a woman might not want to interact with a man. They're not trying to be rude. They have a different understanding of modesty than we do, which is more culturally rooted than religion. A lot of our issues are that the U.S. is a pluribus unum. Out of many, we are one. And these many parts that come together, they come from different parts of the world with a very different understanding of respect and integrity and modesty and decency. And bringing those things together so that we can understand one another. That's always been something that Rabbi Alana and I have worked on a lot when it comes to cultural competency issues. So yeah, just another thought on that.
Oh, let me just piggyback on that really briefly. I just wanted to talk for a minute about I kind of hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, appropriation. So supersessionism, is sort of an earlier problem, the idea that, Christianity replaces Judaism. But there are sort of these good-willed intentions to try and understand Jews, which sometimes go awry. So one of those is like, what do you do about seders, right? Christian churches having seders can either be done well or done incredibly poorly. The good way to do it would be you have like a Jewish community host the Seder and join with them. The way that things can go awry is where the church hosts it and turns the Jewish symbols into Christian ones. First of all, it's ahistorical because during the time of Jesus, the Seder looked completely different than it does today. And almost everything that you see in a modern Seder is a rabbinic era interpretation, right? So it wouldn't have looked like that then. But so, for example, one of the things that you sometimes hear about is like there are 3 matzahs on the table, and a church will say, "Oh, it stands for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." That's really not the way to go. And there's other things like that. I've heard recently of people using the Jewish prayer shawl or blowing the shofar. And granted, these, the tzitzit, the fringes are mentioned in the Bible, and the shofar is mentioned in the Bible. But it would be good to have conversations with your neighbors about like what's a good way to like relate to those things, and what's maybe an awkward, let's just say awkward way to relate to those things. Because I think mostly it's not meant out of ill will or maliciousness. It's just kind of a unthinking in that sense. So I would put that kind of goes under the cultural competencies that Hamza was talking about. And there's other cultural pieces where that works too, like using Native American things, out of context, and sort of, I guess, to understand the idea that faith traditions, like cultural traditions, have a tapestry that needs the context to be understood, right? You can't just kind of randomly pull one piece of a religious view out and use that by itself, because it's part of a larger worldview. And I think that, part of getting to know one another is to start being exposed to that in a way to understand it. And it can be incredibly enriching. I feel like my personal religious and spiritual life is incredibly richer for knowing people of all different faiths, for knowing Muslims, for knowing Christians, for knowing people who have Native American spirituality. Like that's really important to me. And it's been really important for me to understand those things, but not as something that I am doing myself, but rather to say, gosh, the narrative of, God coming down and sacrificing himself for me is really beautiful. It's not how I understand my relationship with the divine, but I also do understand it as a really beautiful narrative. And I love the fact that there are people in the world who have that, and I want to understand it from their perspective.
Amen. Ashe. I mean. If I could, Lee,
yeah.
What Rabbi Suskin just said is like a huge topic of conversation, particularly among Presbyterians right now.
Right.
Also, another huge topic of conversation is Israel-Palestine, and I just want to make a quick plug to something that Rabbi Suskin and I will be doing in webinar format on the 16th of February. Around noon, and it's a continuation of a conversation that she and I started around the Christian's role in Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be good. So I'm just saying that's all I'm saying.
Awesome. And we are so grateful that y'all are here with us. Hamza and Rabbi Suskin, we are grateful for the work that y'all are doing and for being with us today. This was wonderful to have y'all. And we have a couple minutes. Are there any last comments or anything that you want to leave us with before we end? And then I'm going to do a little preview of what is in 2 weeks, and then we'll close this thing out.
And also how we can get in contact with the Pomegranate Initiative too.
Yes.
Sure. There is a website, and you can email us from the website, pomegranateinitiative.org. And you can also just email me or Hamza directly. I'm sure you can. I will make sure that Lee and Reverend Anderson, you have our information. And the only thing I would just say is, like, it's been a real pleasure talking with you all. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to say a few words. And, I look forward to building relationships with you and with the Presbyterian Church, over the next few weeks and in the future. I think this is just really amazing and wonderful. Thank you so much.
And thank you for having us. This has been a lot of fun. I hope that we can do more projects like this together and work with your church across the country to make a difference on the anti-Christian, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism fronts, because they are triple demons. And in a society that has so much flux in it and so much challenge to both institutional understandings of religion, and then also with the rise of so much nationalism and hatefulness, this is the time for the three Abrahamic faiths to work together to combat the true adversary, so to speak, as you say in Hebrew, Satan, in Arabic, shaitan, and in English, Satan, all of which apparently mean the word adversary, and that's hate. God is love, and we can work together to conquer the hatefulness that has filled our hearts because of the void we've created by not engaging in meaningful fellowship up until now. So thank you again for having us.
Yeah, thank y'all so much. And before we close, I am going to put in a plug for February the 7th. We're Just Talk Live. So again, y'all, we're not doing every week. I still don't know how we did that every week, but we're not doing this every week now. But this is happening every other week. So February 7th, we're going to be talking about reproductive justice with Margaret Kamsuka and Tony Bond, who is one of the mothers of reproductive justice. And so I want everyone out there to join us on February the 7th. And we will also have a schedule out as soon as we can about other dates that are coming up for the show. So check it all out. I also want to put in a plug. Unbound also produces a podcast called A Matter of Faith, where we talk about matters of faith and questions. And you can go to matterfaithpodcast.com and you can subscribe wherever you get your podcast. But this will be recorded. And so if you missed it, you can watch the recording. It's on our socials, and we hope you all check those out. But again, thanks to our guests for being with us, and we will talk to you again next time. So blessings, y'all. Bye.
Take care.